Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah from Mormons. This week we're doing Isaiah 23. As you recall, last week we did some more of the burdens for the nations. We've just been doing more and more of those. Last week we did, though, something a little bit closer to home. We did Judah last week, and Jerusalem specifically. The area right in the middle of Jerusalem itself, and I remember the Valley of Vision, right? So this week we're doing Isaiah 23, which is Tyre. The Phoenicians up north. We've talked about them before. We're going to go into them in greater detail today. But notice what Isaiah has been doing. I don't know if this order is originally how it was. I think the order may have been different, although this works just fine. Isaiah, though, is systematically going around and talking about these various nations, all basically from one end of the earth to the other, as far away as the people of his time could have conceived of, and then some, in a few cases. And today we really are going to the ends of the earth. The Phoenicians went all the way out, we know now, to Wales to get tin, surprisingly. Um, and they go out to Spain and to some islands, all over the Mediterranean, really. They settled part of North Africa. They really just go everywhere. And so Isaiah, this chapter, sort of covers his bases. He's systematically gone through and covered all of the earth. And then the next chapter, this is sort of the last burden against the nations. But in the next chapter, he does something kind of like a burden against the nations, but he does it against the entire world. Leave it to Isaiah to do something like that, right? So he does it against the entire world, sort of renouncing the kind of things he's been renouncing in the various nations. And so this is sort of the crowning. The chapter after this is sort of the crowning chapter of all the burdens against the nations. Now, if you've made it this far, going through Isaiah's burden against the nations, I really congratulate you. You've made, as of last week, you've made it 22 chapters through the book of Isaiah out of 66. So you've made it through 1/3 of the book of Isaiah. So congratulations. And I know that this is a lot of time to spend on the book of Isaiah, but as I'm sure you're noticing, you're not just learning about the book of Isaiah, you're learning about the history of the text of the Old Testament, how to figure out sometimes which text is the best one, because that's how we always start, right? We talk about how this chapter relates to the other chapters, and we talk about the textual corruptions in the chapter and how to figure out sort of how to piece it all back together, and which one to use, right? Do you use the Septuagint, the Greek version? Do you go with the Dead Sea Scrolls version? Which is in Hebrew, obviously, sometimes Aramaic, but usually Hebrew? Do you go with the standard Masoretic text, the standard Hebrew text? Do you try to reconstruct something based on all three and throw the Book of Mormon into the mix, which is my standard way of doing it? There are all kinds of different ways that you can do it. But I hope you're getting a sense of this now, of how to go about looking at the text and knowing historical context. Obviously, that's a big deal. But this isn't just useful for the book of Isaiah. You can apply this historical context to the rest of a lot of the Old Testament, because especially the prophets, a lot of these prophets come in during this period between this time where Isaiah himself is operating and the later time where we have the introduction and conclusion of Isaiah, which I think are by somebody much later. You really will have a history of the major parts of the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament where we have the prophets. So when you read any of the rest of the prophets, depending on when they are, you'll be able to plug in some of this information. It's not always going to cross over perfectly, but a lot of it will. So you will now have sort of overall context for the Old Testament. And that was the hope behind this. This isn't just about Isaiah, obviously, as I'm sure you're gathering. This helps you to understand about the ancient Near East in general, the Old Testament in general, so that when you read it, you'll be a more educated reader. It will make more sense to you. Isaiah is just a good vehicle for doing that because, quite frankly, Jesus said, "Bear the words of Isaiah." We feel like we should study it, but we often know very little about it. So this helps us to fill in some of those gaps. So anyway, congratulations on making it a third of the way through. So we're going to be doing, once again, Isaiah 23 this week. And we're going to be talking about the Septuagint version a lot today. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. We've discussed that in the past, but it's important, so I'd like to fill in some gaps I feel like I may have left. So let's just dive right in here to Isaiah 23. Now, as you get into Isaiah 23, as I was reading through it just in the standard Hebrew Masoretic text, the standard version of the Old Testament, I realized that there appeared to be some textual corruption issues. Surprise, surprise. That's one of the standard things we have to deal with every time we do a chapter. How does it relate to the other chapters around it, and what are the textual corruptions? Well, in this chapter, it seems, as I went through, using the Book of Mormon and looking at this editor's sort of MO based on the Book of Mormon, I was able to figure out what I thought the text was supposed to look like. I sort of reconstructed it, and then when I went to check the Septuagint version, lo and behold, the Septuagint version is exactly what I had expected to find based on my projections from the Book of Mormon and the Hebrew text. Now, why would that be? You know, the Septuagint is the Greek translation. Why isn't it just so different? Isn't it, wasn't Isaiah originally talking in Hebrew? Isn't the Septuagint, the Greek version, going to be totally different? And that's what people thought for years. And it does, at times, it does seem that the Greek translator of the book of Isaiah had a tough time dealing with this text, didn't always know what he was looking at. Fair enough. But there are times where the later Masoretic text guys don't know what they're looking at. They don't know what the words mean anymore. So they are thinking of that the words mean something else, because they're thinking of the later meaning of some of the words Isaiah is using, and so they edit the text accordingly. Plus, the guys doing the Masoretic text sometimes will make changes that are sort of hyper-nationalistic, because that's sort of their cultural context at the time they're putting all of this together. Whereas the Septuagint is the exact opposite. The Septuagint is not really xenophobic, the guys making the Septuagint, because they live in Alexandria, Egypt. That's where the Septuagint was translated into Greek, was in Alexandria, Egypt. And so they were surrounded by Gentiles. So Isaiah, one of Isaiah's main themes that we know from the Book of Mormon, which is everybody sort of joining the church and you have one big happy family under Jehovah, that's something that these guys in Alexandria have no problem with. They're really actually probably happy about that, and so they're more than happy to transcribe Isaiah the way probably he would have originally said it. And so by figuring out the bias of the creators of the Masoretic text, the biases really, they probably have quite a few, and figuring out what biases underlay the Greek version, the Septuagint, we can kind of piece together what certain groups would have preserved and what certain groups would have gotten rid of, and then we can sort of reconstruct what it would have looked like. And like I said, just using the Book of Mormon and the Masoretic text, I sort of reconstructed a version in my head, and lo and behold, when I jumped to the Septuagint, that's exactly what I got. So let's just look here at the very beginning of Isaiah 23. The burden of Tyre. Howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste, so that there is no house, no entering in. From the land of Kittim it is revealed to them. Be still, ye inhabitants of the isle, thou whom the merchants of Zidon that pass over the sea have replenished. And by great waters the seed of Sihor, the harvest of the river, is her revenue, and she is a mart of nations. Be thou ashamed, O Zidon, for the sea hath spoken, even the strength of the sea, saying, I travail not, nor bring forth children, neither do I nourish up young men, nor bring up virgins. At the report concerning Egypt, so shall they be sorely pained at the report of Tyre. Pass ye over to Tarshish, howl, ye inhabitants of the isle. Is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is of ancient days? Her own feet shall carry her afar off to sojourn. Who hath taken this counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes, whose traffickers are the honorable of the earth? The Lord of hosts hath purposed it, to stain the pride of all glory, and to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth. Pass through thy land as a river, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more strength. Now, as I said, this chapter is quite textually corrupt. But thankfully, the Septuagint preserves what I think is a pretty good version for us. Um, there's still some issues to deal with, even in the Septuagint version, but we'll try to piece something together. So, where is Tyre? That's a good point to think about right off the bat. Tyre is in what is today Phoenicia. Now, picture a map of Israel and Judah. You have the Mediterranean, right? Israel and Judah are on the east coast of the Mediterranean. Judah's in the south, Israel's in the north. Phoenicia is right above Israel. Okay, so it's just, you got Judah, you got Israel, and then you got Phoenicia. So Phoenicia is where Jezebel is from. You remember Jezebel from the Elijah story? She tries to kill Elijah. Jezebel is from Phoenicia. But not to paint it in such a dark cast, Tyre is in Phoenicia, and Hiram, the king there, helps Solomon with the temple. So you have all these Phoenician guys coming down to help to build the temple. So there is sort of a constant back and forth between Israel, Judah, and Phoenicia. Now, we mentioned this before, but I'll just sort of run through it again. What makes these places such significant places? How are these people sustaining themselves? Well, Phoenicia is a commercial empire. They have these little shellfish that they use to make purple dye. This purple dye was some of the most valuable stuff in the ancient world, pound for pound. So they would, if I understand, sometimes ship the dye, although I think it's sometimes difficult to do that. At other times, they would get fabric from other places, sometimes Mesopotamia, and what is today sort of Iraq. Mesopotamia is a funny thing to say. Sometimes it means one region and sometimes it means another region. But what is today Iraq specialized in fabric production. They produced a lot of linen, and they raised a lot of sheep so they could produce a lot of wool as well, and other things like that. India has been producing fabric for forever, from basically time immemorial until the East India Company put them out of business. They were just producing fabric all the time. And so maybe even some fabric from India they're dyeing. So these guys are right in the middle of a giant distribution hub for the Mediterranean world and the Middle East. And so one of the things they would do is they would dye this fabric from around the Near East and possibly India. They would send it to all these other places around the Mediterranean, out to places like Greece, to what is today Tunisia and sort of the middle of North Africa. They would go all the way out to Spain and all the way up and around, we know now, to get tin out of Wales, believe it or not, during different periods. They would go out to Sardinia and Corsica, probably, to get silver, and that may be where Tarshish is. It might be in Spain, it might be either Sardinia or Corsica, or it might be a little bit closer to home in Asia Minor. However, I don't think so, and by Asia Minor I mean Turkey. I don't think so, though. I think it's probably in Sardinia and or Corsica and or maybe Spain. That's just kind of what people are thinking these days. That's kind of where the consensus is. And it seems like they're getting silver from there, and that would make sense because that part of the world was well known for having a lot of silver in the early days. So they seem to be getting silver from Tarshish. They probably trade dyed cloth for silver over in Tarshish. They go and grab some grain down in Egypt and then bring it up back to Phoenicia. And it's very likely that they had such a giant commercial empire that they didn't really worry much about feeding themselves. They have these giant cedars of Lebanon, used to build the temple sometimes, used at least part of the temple, used to build part of Solomon's various giant building projects, including some on his own house, I think. But these big, tall cedar trees were perfect for making giant ships that could travel all the way across the Mediterranean, which is known for its storms. If you read the Book of Acts, you know the Mediterranean is not a friendly place to be if you're in a boat. But these guys made really big, long, tough, sturdy ships out of these really tall trees, these cedars, and were able to just cruise around the Mediterranean, getting stuff from what at the time would have seemed like the ends of the earth to these people. And so, um, and one thing also, Tyre at the time is built on an island. It's not an island anymore. Alexander the Great knocked the suburbs of the city, which were built on the mainland, knocked that city down, pushed the rubble into the sea. I kid you not, pushed the rubble into the sea, turned it into a causeway, and marched across to take Tyre. So he turned Tyre, what used to be an island, into a peninsula. A little bit mind-blowing, but that's how Alexander the Great did business. So, but it used to be an island, a little island right off the coast there, and it was basically this impenetrable island fortress that was the center of this commercial, kind of the commercial capital of the ancient world. I don't think that's an overstatement. It was a big deal, and people probably would have thought that it never could have fallen. But if all of your commercial empire is conquered, or some of the major pillars of your commercial empire are conquered, things are going to go not quite so well for you. So that's what this is about. He says, "Howl, ye ships of Tarshish." Interestingly, the Septuagint guys don't know where Tarshish is. They translate it as Carthage. They think that it's in the middle of North Africa. This is probably not true. So it shows that, once again, I think the Septuagint does a good job with this chapter, but there's still sometimes some issues. So I'm still going to be having to piece it together from the various sections. So forgive the eclectic approach, but we just have to do that sometimes. So it says, "Howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste, that there is no house, no entering in. From the land of Kittim it is revealed to them." Now, because of some funny problems with the text, I would probably translate this as, "Howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for she has been destroyed, and people don't come anymore from the land of Kittim, because she has been led captive." So, Tarshish, the ships coming out of Tarshish don't have any place to dock anymore. Why? They used to be able to stop in Egypt and also in Kittim, which is today Cyprus, just off the coast. Well, not quite just off the coast. When I say Tyre's just off the coast, it really is right off the coast. But um, Cyprus is a little bit farther away. But it was one of the main stopping points that Tyre was able to use to sort of get water and supplies and things like that. Well, suddenly they don't have these anymore. So people aren't coming anymore from the land of Kittim, from Cyprus. So the ships coming out of Tarshish suddenly they don't have any place to stop, because Kittim, or Cyprus, has been taken captive. And this is exactly what happens. The Assyrians come in, they take out all of Phoenicia, a lot of Phoenicia, and they also take Cyprus captive. And obviously, once that happens, they no longer have any place to stop to fill up with water to and fro, going all the way out to the Western Mediterranean. And here in the next verse, we have, once again, I've mentioned before, this editor is a little bit nationalistic, and that's exactly what we see here. He's taking these countries and kind of inserting them where they don't belong, moving them around throughout the chapter and even from other chapters. And so that's what we see here. So it says, verse 2 says, "Be still, ye inhabitants of the isle, thou whom the merchants of Zidon that pass over the sea have replenished. And by great waters the seed of Sihor, the harvest of the river, is her revenue, and she is a mart of nations. Well, in the Septuagint, which I think is probably more correct, it says it's been talking about these people, right? There's no more harborage for these ships coming to and fro across the Mediterranean. And why? Because Cyprus has been led captive. So it says, to whom have become, or you guys have become just like those that dwell on the island, the merchants of Lebanon, going across the sea on great waters, an offspring of merchants. The merchants of the nations are just like when the harvest is being gathered in. So that's probably what I would say. So it's quite different here. But this is sort of a classic thing. This is a sort of a rhetorical question. It's more like, who do you think, or who's become like those on the island? These merchants of Phoenicia, they're always crossing the sea on the water. They're going on ships all the time. And they've been doing this for years and years. That's the implication, right? Who was like you guys, right? You guys think you're so great. Nobody is as awesome as you guys, going to and fro across the Mediterranean, doing all this great stuff, shipping everywhere. And then he says, the merchants of the nations are going to be like when the harvest is gathered in. You guys think you're so great. Well, you're going to get mown down, just like when grain is mown down in the field. Now, this is sort of a pun because he knows that they can't do any agriculture. They live on a little island, right? They're a purely commercial nation, and he will make fun of them for that in just a minute. But this is more standard Isaiah. This is one of his. We'll see some of his more biting sarcasm in this chapter. But we see that perhaps the best of Isaiah's sarcasm is preserved in the Book of Mormon versions. I think people might have been a little bit disturbed by it and may have changed it a little bit so that it's actually preserved best in the Book of Mormon. But we still get the flavor of some of Isaiah's sarcasm, and we get some of his funniest stuff actually in this chapter. But he says, yeah, you guys think you're so great. Well, you're going to get mown down, just like rain is mown down in the field. So then in 4 it says, be thou ashamed, O Zidon, for the sea hath spoken, even the strength of the sea, saying, I travail not, nor bring forth children, neither do I nourish up young men, nor bring up virgins. As at the report concerning Egypt, so shall they be sorely pained at the report of Tyre. And so I would probably, out of the Greek version, I'd probably translate this something like, Sidon, you should be ashamed, said the sea. And the strength of the sea said, I haven't gotten pregnant, or given birth, or raised up young men, or raised up young women. In other words, you really think the sea is going to help you now? When your commercial empire comes falling down around the years, you're not going to have the food to support your own population. This is actually exactly what happened during World War II for the British. The German submarines were sinking so many ships coming from all around the world that the British had a tough time supporting themselves at home. Because what had happened was they had made so much money by shipping that they were able to import a lot of their grain, especially from Canada, but also from other parts of the world. And so their population could become much larger than what the islands of just, Great Britain were able to support by themselves. And had the blockade been completely successful and no ships from Canada were able to bring grain over, Britain really would have starved. A huge number of the population probably would have starved. And this is exactly what we're seeing here. Suddenly, their commercial empire is falling down around them. They don't have the land area to support themselves. They're this little island nation, remember? Now, Sidon is not quite like Tyre. Sidon is right there on the coast, but still, they have a much larger population than they can support via their own agriculture. So the sea is even making fun of them here in this verse. You think you think you can support your entire population just based off of me? I'm afraid that's not going to happen. Um, and it says in verse 5, when people in Egypt hear about it, uh, pain, agony concerning Tyre will take hold of them. Why? Because Tyre was one of their main markets. Egypt is an empire based on grain production. And quite frankly, the Babylonian Empire will be similar. It's just that it has really good soil because of the flooding. The flooding of the Nile brings in new topsoil every year. We've talked about this, and that helps with the agriculture. It makes it absolutely fantastic agriculture. So they can just grow grain predictably all the time, every year, and it's trading this grain that makes it sort of the breadbasket of the ancient world through the Roman period, even. Um, and in fact, in some ways, even there are other parts of the world too that have their empires sort of based around grain production. During certain periods, it was almost as good as printing your own money. And so Egypt is one of those. But Egypt is freaking out now because Tyre can't buy all their grain. And so their economy is going to go through the floor. Um, and once again, it shows they need this grain to survive. They need to be able to import this grain from Egypt to support their population. Well, Isaiah is saying they're not going to be able to do it anymore. So then in 6 it says, "Pass ye over to Tarshish, howl ye inhabitants of the isle." So it says, yeah, go ahead, try and even get to Tarshish. Now that your commercial empire has been destroyed and that all your stopping places you usually went through have been totally taken out, yeah, go ahead and try. But it's not going to do you any good at this point. So he says, people dwell on the island, and presumably the island in that case is actually Tarshish. Presumably it's either Corsica or Sardinia or one of those areas. He says, you guys are going to be sad too. Why? Because you can't sell your silver anymore. Was this not? Yeah, so then in verse 7 we get, "Is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is of ancient days? Her own feet shall carry her off to sojourn. Who hath taken this counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes, whose traffickers are the honorable of the earth?" So this is probably better translated as, wasn't this your pride from the beginning, before she was handed over? In other words, weren't you guys always bragging about all these fantastic places that you guys had settled all over the Mediterranean? Because they had settled all these different places. Isn't this what you guys had been so proud about from the very beginning? Before you were forced to give all these colonies away to the Assyrians and forced to be able to just leave them because you couldn't get to them anymore. So I think that's the idea there. And he says, "Who do you think has planned all these things against Tyre? Who is the one that's doing this? Is Tyre inferior? Does she have no strength?" And that's what what it says in the Septuagint. Who do you think has figured out all these things to do against Tyre? Is Tyre this kind of worthless place? Is it totally just run out of steam? And he says, no, her traders, her merchantmen are the best. They're the kings of the earth. Right? So he's saying, you guys have all these great places, and you were so proud of them. And you thought you were going to be able to support them by yourself. You thought you were going to be able to keep your massive commercial empire together by yourself. But is Tyre falling apart because she's just kind of worthless? As Isaiah says, clearly not. Her merchants are the best. Her merchants go off and they found colonies and they become kings. They become kings of the earth. No, no, no. There's clearly something else going on here. And we get what that is in verse 9. The Lord of hosts hath purposed it, to stain the pride of all glory and to bring in contempt all the honorable of the earth. This isn't just something happening naturally. The Lord of hosts, Yahweh, is the one doing this. He's the one making sure that Tyre and Sidon's and the Phoenician commercial empire falls to pieces. This is not something that would have happened naturally. And he's doing this once again to humble people, to stain the pride of all glory, and to bring in contempt all the honorable of the earth. To humble people. That's his main purpose for doing all these things. And then in verse 10 he mocks them. Verse 10 says, Pass through thy land as a river, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more strength. Well, I would probably translate that as, from based on the Septuagint, yeah, go ahead. Try to work your land. There aren't any more ships coming out of Tarshish. You guys, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and try to irrigate and work your land and do agriculture on your little tiny area. Because there aren't any more ships coming out of Tarshish. You can't just trade all your food, trade for all your food anymore. You have to go ahead and try to work your land, but good luck for that, because you have probably about 3 or 4 times the number of population than you can possibly support by doing agriculture. So it's a very sarcastic and very disturbing image. You know that starvation is imminent for these people. And this does appear to be what happens. The Assyrians come in, their commercial empire does indeed take a major hit, and some bad things start to happen to them. They rather than starving to death, a lot of the population dies in the invasion, and then a lot of them get exported, as was the Assyrian sort of style to sort of export people out to different places. But this is a very disturbing image, and of course Isaiah wants it to be disturbing. Isaiah is trying to get Israel and Judah to realize what a pickle they're in, and that they can't really escape. But also, I can't help but wonder if Isaiah isn't assuming that this is going to get out to people in other places. I think that's a possibility. Because you remember Isaiah makes that prophecy, and then it doesn't seem to have come true in one of his burdens against the nations. Well, it's possible that Isaiah said that, but that word of it got out to this country, and they said, maybe we should repent. Right, that doesn't seem outside the realm of possibility for me. We know that people knew about prophets in other areas because the word just kind of got around. You'll remember, of course, Naaman from all the way up in Syria comes down to Elisha. Why? Because he's taken an little Israelite girl captive, and she says, well, you got leprosy. I know a guy. He can help you out. He just lives down here in Judah. He can help you out, right? So that's what we see throughout the Old Testament. So the idea that Isaiah is giving the prophecies for Israel and Judah, sure. But I think also it's possible that he's thinking that word might get around. Who knows? But Isaiah calls out pride wherever he sees it, and whoever he sees exhibiting it. And if it happens to be the Phoenicians, fine. If it's the king of the world, fine. He's called out the king of Assyria before. He'll do it again. So I think that's one of the main things we're seeing here. This is sort of the theme that runs through all this. So yeah, very sarcastic. But he makes his point, to say the least. So now here in 11 through 18, we're getting, this is probably the most difficult part of the text. but I'm going to try to piece it back together a little bit between the various versions. We have to part company a little bit with the Septuagint, but I think I'll be able to sort of piece something back together. And once again, we're doing this based on the Book of Mormon. This is going to be totally crazy for people who aren't members of the church. That's why we don't really have much of anything like this. I'm approaching the Book of Mormon going from the known to the unknown. I know the Book of Mormon is a valid ancient text. I know that that version of Isaiah is good. It's much, much less corrupt than the other versions we have, simply because it only had to be copied down a few times, right? Not to mention the fact that we know that prophets are involved in the process with the Book of Mormon. Let's think about it. We have um, the Nephites copying stuff down from the brass plates, right? Then we have Mormon and Moroni copying things down into the gold plates. Okay, and in those two occasions, some mistakes may have been made, right? And in the original putting things down into the brass plates, there may have been some mistakes made. And then we get it in the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith is reading it right off of the Urim and Thummim, reading it out loud, and his scribes are writing it down, and they sometimes make mistakes. We actually know that because we can see the manuscripts now. We have some copies of the original manuscript, at least pieces of the original manuscript. We can actually see where they're making mistakes, which is actually very interesting. But these presumably would have been mostly fixed. A lot of those have been fixed by later editors coming through the church hire to make sure that those things were fixed. But also, presumably, some of those things might have been fixed by the Holy Ghost, while Joseph Smith, making sure that the right words show up on the Urim and Thummim wouldn't have been difficult for God to make sure that he was getting the best text. And so presumably the version of Isaiah we have in the Book of Mormon is much, much better than the other versions. Because think about that. They're not writing on plates. So they just have to keep writing, copying onto parchment and copying onto parchment. And even if there was no malicious changes of the text, and we know that's not true, but even if there weren't any malicious changes of the text, you're still going to have problems because you have to keep copying it from parchment to papyrus to parchment to parchment, right? Rather than plates, which are going to last indefinitely, you can always just go back to the plates. That's not the way it is for these guys. It's just keep copying it onto perishable material after perishable material after perishable material. And so the Book of Mormon we know is much better. So we can take the Book of Mormon and apply it to the stuff in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament rather than the other way around, taking the Old Testament, which we often do, and holding it up to sort of validate or prove the Book of Mormon. I feel like that's backwards. The Book of Mormon we know to be valid, so let's use it to make sense of the Old Testament, rather than taking the Old Testament and saying, look, this sort of proves the Book of Mormon, right? But once again, that means that this only really works for an LDS audience, and so that's why people do that. They want to be able to connect to people outside of an LDS audience, so they sort of hold up things from the Old Testament to sort of prove the Book of Mormon, and that makes sense, right? But I'm not really dealing with people outside of an LDS audience. I mean, those that are interested in this stuff that aren't LDS, obviously, they're more than welcome. But I take the approach that, well, I already know the Book of Mormon to be the most valid text, so let's apply what we already know from the Book of Mormon, superimpose it onto other things, to go from, as I said, the known to the unknown. And so that's what I'm doing here. So I'm getting a different version, all that to say, I'm getting a much different version here of the rest of this than what you might necessarily get in another situation. But like I said, I think I'm able to sort of reconstruct what it might have originally looked like. So here he says, "He stretched out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms. The Lord hath given a commandment against the merchant city to destroy the strongholds thereof. And he said, Thou shalt no more rejoice, O thou oppressed virgin, daughter of Zion. Arise, pass over to Kittim. There also shalt thou have no rest. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, this people was not, till the Assyrian founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness. They set up the towers thereof, they raised up the palaces thereof, and he brought it to ruin. Howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. And it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre shall be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. After the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as an harlot. Take an harp, go about the city, thou harlot that hast been forgotten. Make sweet melodies, sing many songs, that thou mayest be remembered. And it shall come to pass after the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre. She shall turn to her hire, and shall commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world upon the face of the earth. And her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. It shall not be treasured nor laid up, but for her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord, to eat sufficiently, and for durable clothing. Now, what do you immediately notice about that? Not terribly complimentary towards women, violently nationalistic. Aren't those the two major things that we've talked about before as being what this editor does? So, let's jump to the Septuagint. It gives us, through some subtle tweaking, gives us almost the exact opposite sense. So, let's go back just a little bit to verse 10. 10 and 11, I think, are kind of supposed to go together, at least 10 in the first half of 11. So it says, yeah, you try to work, go ahead and try to work your land. There aren't any more ships coming from Tarshish. But your hand, which ticked off kings, so this is my own translation, as you can tell. I'm just shooting from the hip, going from Greek here. For your hand, which ticked off kings, isn't strong by sea anymore. So you're going to have to do things yourself, in other words, because your little happy little commercial empire, you were so strong out there at sea, well, it's just not like that anymore. You made all your neighbors angry through your commercial empire and your sort of wheeling and dealing all around the Mediterranean. Well, those days are over. So then we get this. The Lord of hosts commanded concerning Phoenicia to destroy her strength. Now, what is this, though? And I think this might actually be talking about something a little bit down the line. So basically, he says, you guys are at the bottom of the pit. You guys are as low as you can possibly go. But then the Lord was going to command concerning Canaan that her strength be destroyed, concerning Phoenicia. This may be after the Assyrians have taken over, and that's what I think we see from the next verse. And they will say, you will no longer continue to do wrong and to insult the daughter of Sidon. Even if you run away to Cyprus, you won't be able to get a break even there. If you run to the land of Babylonia, this has also been made like a wilderness by the Assyrians, because her wall has fallen. So, in other words, you will no longer continue to insult and do wrong to the daughter of Sidon. That's the strange part of this verse. But I think it actually works better. The idea being, after the Assyrians have come in and taken everything out, somebody else is going to come in and take them out. And all these people are going to try to run away. And they will say, you will no longer continue to insult and do terrible things to the daughter of Sidon. So just like Sidon and Tyre can't run away from the Assyrians, the Assyrians are going to have no place to run from the Babylonians. They're going to try to get on ships and run away to Cyprus. They're going to try to run down um, to Babylon, run down to Babylon, but it's not going to work out for them. That I think is one interpretation. Although the whole thing about Babylon may just be an insertion. In Greek and in Hebrew, it doesn't really flow. Um, and once again, we know that this guy has a fondness for nationalistic insertions. So it may be best actually to jump right over that and just go straight to verse 14. And in fact, we'll do that right now. And they'll say, you will no longer continue to do bad things and to insult the daughter of Sidon. Even if you run away to Cyprus, you're not going to get a break there. Wail, you ships of Tarshish. So, but this is presumably later. This is when the Assyrians now are wailing. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, because your fortress has perished. And it shall be on that day that Tyre will be left alone for 70 years, will be abandoned for 70 years, as the reign of a king, like like the lifetime of a man. And it shall be that after 70 years, Tyre will sing that one song about a prostitute. Presumably, Isaiah is talking about that one song everybody knows, I guess, somehow. Or sing a song like a prostitute might sing, something like that. So this is very different, right? So Tyre gets taken out, but then the people who took out Tyre are themselves taken out. And so Tyre gets a little bit of a break and is able to reassert itself. And that's exactly what we see happening. So if we pull out that verse completely, that does seem to be what we're looking at. Once again, this is a reconstruction based on sort of, if we remove some of the violent nationalistic and anti-feminine things that we get that we can tell because of the Book of Mormon is what's being inserted onto the text, then this is the picture that's painted. So this is much less violently nationalistic. This is more like what we saw at the very beginning about Babylon. That's not necessarily being a Phoenician. That's the problem. It's being arrogant. That's the problem. And God wants everybody to sort of be part of the family. And that's what we see here. So he's saying, you guys, just be upset. You guys are going to be really upset because just like you took these guys out, you yourselves are going to get taken out. Referring to these Syrians. And it's going to be abandoned for 70 years like the time of the king. Presumably, and that's the entire reign of a king. And actually that's exactly what we get in some of the Assyrian annals, interestingly enough. That's the sort of prototypical, what they think of when they think of the reign of a king. And then Tyre will sing this song about a prostitute. Or, we'll sing the song like the song about a prostitute. Or we'll sing like a prostitute, maybe. But the idea is Tyre has sort of been with all these other nations, doing business with all these other nations. And all the stuff about shipping seed from Egypt over the waters, definitely a little bit of a sexual connotation. I don't think it would have been lost on his audience. Okay, they know that they're getting seed from Egypt all the time over the waters, and those themes running through this chapter, like I said, I don't think they would have been lost on Isaiah's audience. Kind of sexual connotations, and we'll get this later on in the Book of Revelation. We get this also in the Book of Mormon, where we see the foreign nation as this sort of harlot, right? And but this is where this originally sort of stems from, I think, actually, at least one of the places. So Tyre, who's sort of been in bed with all these other nations as far as trade is concerned, is going to realize that maybe it should try to get its commercial empire going again. So it's going to sort of try to drum up business. Once again, this is quite insulting, and you can't help but wonder if there are some issues here. But actually, it sort of redeems itself in the Septuagint version, where it doesn't in the standard Masoretic text, which makes me think this may actually be original to Isaiah. Let me just sort of continue with it and show you why I think that. So he said the song is interesting. Take a stringed instrument, take a guitar. Rome, you city, you forgotten prostitute, play the guitar well. Sing much, or the lyre, the stringed instrument. Sing much, that you may be remembered. Sort of mocking it. Oh, you need to strum up business again. Go sing lovely songs to induce customers to come work with you. Right? That's the idea. Kind of crude, obviously. But then in the standard Hebrew text, and what we have in the King James, it says that she will strum up business, and it'll work out, and she'll commit fornication with all the kings of the world upon the face of the earth. But then it says, and all her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. And you go, prostitution, holiness to the Lord, like it doesn't really work out. And in fact, in the law of Moses, it specifically says, you will not take the price of a harlot into the temple, right? So it's kind of funny that Isaiah would say that. So what I see is, yeah, Isaiah may be doing that, but I think what's more likely is what we get in the Septuagint, because it sort of seems to redeem itself, and once again, it's a little bit less anti-woman, and that's what we would expect the original to be, because we know that anti-woman edits have been put into the later versions based on the Book of Mormon. So what it says here in 17 is, and it shall be that after 70 years God will pay a visit to Tyre, and shall be restored again to her old estate, and will be the marketplace for the kingdoms of the earth. So after 70 years she'll be restored to the way she used to be. Why? Because God will visit Tyre. And she'll become a marketplace for all the kingdoms of the world. So she's going to try to sort of strum a business, but God is going to be the one to actually restore her. And that fits more with the rest of the book of Isaiah. Fits much better, I think. So then we get, and her merchandise and her wages, her merchandise and her hire will be holiness to the Lord. It will not be treasured nor laid up. And Tyre's not going to keep it for itself, in other words. For all her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord, to eat and drink and be filled, as a covenant and a memorial in the presence of the Lord. That's something that we don't, entire phrase, we don't get in the standard Hebrew. The idea is that Tyre, who was sort of the most sort of degenerate of all kingdoms, is going to be redeemed by the Lord, and all the money that Tyre makes is going to be consecrated to the Lord. That's what that means. Holiness to the Lord means consecrated to the Lord, completely given to the Lord. And the money that Tyre makes is going to be used specifically for the temple, and that's the language there. That it's not going to be laid out. They're not going to keep it. It's going to be for them that dwell before the Lord, to eat sufficiently and for durable clothing. They used to make donations so that the priests could eat things that they might not get via sacrifice, and also clothes for themselves. They would have the skins from the sacrifice, but they needed sometimes other clothes. And that's this idea here, is that this is going to support the temple. And that's a really fantastic image, this idea that the entire earth is going to be consecrated to the Lord. Even Tyre, who's depicted as a harlot earlier on, is going to be consecrated to the Lord. And all the money she makes is going to be consecrated to the Lord. And this ties back to other things that we get earlier about the whole world being like a temple. This is the way Isaiah really wants it to be. And so we've been talking about all the burdens of the nations. But remember, this is a systematic way of doing something that is new, or at least it's new to Isaiah's audience. This idea that God is an international deity. He's not a regional deity. That no matter where you go in the world, God is there making, sort of controlling things, making sure things work out okay. And this takes that one step further and says, Tyre's giant commercial empire, which covers the entire Mediterranean, is going to be holy to the Lord, consecrated to the Lord, as a sort of a first step for the world becoming consecrated to the Lord. Yeah, Tyre has quite a history. He's depicted as a harlot, like I've said before. And yet even her, even she can become holy to the Lord. Even her merchandise can be used to support the temple. And I think that that's a very significant point that Isaiah wants to make. It's not about who you are. It's not about where you live. It's not about your past. It's about repentance. It's about your future. Come to the Lord. Everybody on earth can be one part of one big, happy Yahwist family. Everybody can worship Jehovah. That's what Isaiah is talking about. He wants the world to be one big, happy family under God. And that's what we get here. And he doesn't care about your nationality. And that's going to be really important for people later. Like I've said, through all these burdens against the nations, Isaiah has systematically gone through all the nations and said, doesn't matter how far you run, God's always going to be there to punish you when you do wrong, but he's also going to be there to lift you up when you return to him. And we see here, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter what your past is, God is going to be there to bring you back into his presence as a covenant and a memorial in the presence of the Lord. And that's what Isaiah wants us to remember, I think. So anyway, that's chapter 23. That's the end of the burdens of the nations. We'll get to Isaiah calling out the whole world in chapter 24. So we will see you guys next time.